Daniel, how are you?
Risa, hey, I live in Mexico. What do you think? I love it.
I know you are, and not only do you live in Mexico, you live in Puerto Vallarta, which is like the hottest spot in Mexico these days. I
Yep.
mean, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I know. I love it there. But today we're going to talk about actually how to help people buy a property, right? Because it's so different from buying property in the US or Canada or other parts of the world. So I figured it would be great, since you're the expert, to give us a little insight into what people really need to know before they even go and, search online for a property.
Sure. Well, if my thing is this, I mean, if I'm going to be buying a property in a different country, I want to associate myself with a reputable real estate agent because, the how we purchase property, like in New York, I mean, the laws are different in New York versus California, where I'm from. So to think that everything is going to be the same as where you came from in Mexico, it's a losing battle. So you really need to get yourself connected with the right real estate professional before doing anything. You could always, start looking at properties online, but again, what you're looking at online from the public side might be very different than what the real estate professional is looking at because some of the properties on the public side, they're either sold, the information is incorrect, it's outdated. They're posting that it belongs to such and such person, but it doesn't belong to them, or it was never for sale. They're kind of fishing for something. So you can just imagine there are a lot of disasters waiting to happen. So get yourself connected with the right agent before getting really serious about starting to look at homes and putting in an offer. Now, in Vallarta,
Well, let me ask you, how do you
mhm.
know whether or not someone is reputable?
Well, nowadays, it's kind of easy to kind of find out and get referrals, right? So there are a lot of social groups online. You can start looking there. If you have any friends, that have moved to PV or they know someone who's moved to Vallarta or somewhere else in Mexico, you can contact them and get for referrals. And then ask to speak with maybe some of their clients, and see what their experience was like working with that agent.
Yeah, no, that's great. But there's
Yeah.
also this organization called AMPI, right? What does that stand for?
So it's an association of Mexican real estate professionals here in Mexico. And AMPI also has a website where you can go and look for AMPI members throughout the country, right? We want to make sure they're still, in the business, excuse me, before making a
But you don't
decision.
necessarily need to be an AMPI member in order to sell real estate, right?
No, you don't. So that's another thing to really, kind of keep in mind is that you don't have to be licensed in Mexico to sell real estate. So don't be surprised if your cab driver wants to sell you real estate. Um, and that's
Well,
kind of
that's
the case
frightening.
in other parts of the world too, right? It's not just Mexico in Mexico, but I think where things are headed, they're kind of indicating where they're kind of headed. They're trying to make this a licensed profession. So eventually it might get there at some point, but right now you don't have to have a license to sell real estate, at least not here in PV.
So the biggest difference between buying real estate in the US, Canada, other parts of the world, and Mexico is this whole restricted zone, right? So can you explain what the restricted zone is and what is that?
Yeah, sure. So if the foreigner is acquiring property in the restricted zone is 50 kilometers from the coastline and 100 kilometers from the international border. In this region, if you're buying it as a foreign individual, the title has to be held in a real estate trust, right? It has a term of 50 years and it could renew it another 50 years indefinitely. If you're buying the property more than 50 kilometers inland from the coastline or more than 100 kilometers inland from the border, then you don't need a real estate trust. You also don't need a real estate trust if you're buying in the restricted zone, but you're buying it through a Mexican corporation or if you're a Mexican national. So, and the way the trust works is a an authorized bank holds the title. It's not an asset of the bank. Um, and you're the primary beneficiary of the trust, and then you could have your substitute beneficiaries, kind of like your heirs. And you just pay an annual trust fee, which is right now on the average around $450 plus tax. So that's I think around $522, and that's due on the anniversary of your closing. Well, it's supposed to be due, but sometimes it's in the trust bank's computer system a little bit later. So the first year you're going to pay your annual trust fee. You have to double check to make sure exactly when it's due because it might not be the date of your closing, even though it's supposed to be. And then you have your property tax that's due at the beginning of the year as well.
So what is that? So do you know why the property has to be held in a trust?
Yes. So what happened was, a number of years ago, the government realized that they're losing out a lot of real estate investment opportunity to foreigners. They didn't want foreigners to own outright under their name. They were kind of worried about the foreigners are going to own all the prime real estate market along the coastline and by the border. So you couldn't. So they created this mechanism for foreigners to acquire property and thus having investments coming into the country.
So what happens if it's a couple where one is a Mexican national and the other is not? What happens in that case?
Sure. So long as one of the buyers is a foreigner, it doesn't matter how many Mexican nationals there are when you're purchasing in the restricted zone, you have to have a trust. For example, let's say you have a Mexican family with 10 siblings, and one of them is married to a foreigner, let's say an American, and all 11 of them are are pitching in money. They're going to be the primary beneficiaries of the property. You have to have a trust, right? Because you have one foreigner that's acquiring the property along with the 10 Mexican nationals. But if they're buying the property more than 50 kilometers inland from the restricted zone, then you won't need a real estate trust. You could have the title directly under their names.
Wow. And so, or you convince the non-Mexican not to be on the title, basically.
Yeah, that's another option. You don't have the spouse on title.
So that's interesting. So, but if you are, say, buying in San Miguel de Allende or Guadalajara or Mexico City, you don't have to deal with those issues. You just purchase outright. Is that right?
Yeah, and really, Risa, it's not so much an issue. You just don't need the real estate trust. And some people kind of get freaked out. They're like, well, how does that work? Does the bank own it? Can they take the property? The answer is no. The bank doesn't own it. And they can't take the property. If the bank for some reason folds, by law that trust is going to go to another authorized bank, and that's it. And it's a really great mechanism because in the trust you can put in there who your beneficiaries are going to be. So let's say you got 3 kids, you're going to leave it to them, and that's it. They're getting it. It's going to be almost impossible to contest it. So if somebody comes out of the woodworks and says, hey, I'm a legal heir, blah blah blah, and well, you're not in the trust. So it's a really great mechanism to secure investments in real estate.
Yeah. And actually, yeah, a trust is just another layer of protection for yourself as well, which is kind of nice.
Yes.
So when people are purchasing, I understand that it's like 90% or more. It's all cash. Is that right?
So in our market here, most of our foreigners that are purchasing, most of them being American and Canadian, just for us, over 90% of them are purchasing cash. Mortgages are available in Mexico. You can definitely get a mortgage. It's a peso loan down here. There are a couple of dollar loans that are in the works that are coming out, but for the most part, it's going to be a peso loan. So people say, oh, mortgages aren't available in Mexico. It's not true. It is available. Interest rates are a little bit higher over here. They have come down a little bit since I started real estate, but when you compare it to the States, it's a few points more. And you do have closing costs on the loan as well. So you just have to look at that with the mortgage broker here, what the numbers are going to look like. But sometimes you might be able to qualify more than you think you can qualify for, and sometimes you don't. So if you're going to be getting a mortgage in Mexico, I would advise you to get in contact with a mortgage broker here so they can start looking at those numbers so you know exactly what range you need to look at for a home.
Right, right. And so what other things should people be thinking about? I know you've mentioned in past conversations about really being careful about anything that you're putting into your property and understanding what the sales process is going to be like before you even purchase a property.
Yeah.
And
Well,
why do you recommend that?
Yeah, I mean, in Vallarta, we use escrow, but escrow is not, it's not something that's common in the real estate market in Mexico. So if you go to other parts of the country and you bring up the word escrow, they're going to look at you like, what's that? So they don't use it. So that's something that a lot of the Americans and Canadian real estate professionals that moved to PV kind of brought into the market. And but an escrow here in Mexico is not like an escrow in the States. The only thing that an escrow does, it's kind of like a holding company. All it does is hold the money, kind of like a bank, and disperses it. It has no other involvement in the real estate transaction. They don't do a title search. They don't do anything else. They just hold the money and then disperse after the closing once they review all the closing documents. So that's something common over here. Old world Mexico in the real estate, sometimes the buyer wires all the money to the seller, a day or two before closing, or they wire the money to the seller on the day of closing, once the deed is signed or just beforehand. So, I mean, don't freak out. Oh my God, I'm sending all this money. If you're gonna do something like that, and if you're purchasing in a particular market where they don't use escrow, look at all the options, check with your real estate attorney. And we've talked about this before, Lisa. It's really important to always hire a reputable real estate attorney and an agent to look after your best interest. Don't just believe anyone. There's a lot of rumors and gossip, and you can lose money if you don't pay attention. So get involved with a reputable real estate attorney, and then the notary that's going to be performing the operation to see, what they suggest as well, what their recommendation is. Because all real estate operations has to go through a notary's office when transferring title from the seller to the buyer. It's not done, at the real estate agent's office or at the escrow company. The notary is the one that transfer title, and they're the ones that are responsible for doing the title search on the property as well. So there are different mechanisms to make the transaction move forward and happen. It just might not be escrow, right? And that's what we're kind of accustomed to in the States. I think in Canada they do it a little bit differently as well. They don't use escrow, according to my Canadian friends and clients. But different countries, different parts of the world, they have different systems in place. So you have to really kind of dig in and to make sure wherever you're purchasing that mechanism is secure and your money is going to be safe.
So you touched upon the notary. The notary is very important in any sort of real
Yes.
estate transaction in Mexico, but they function very differently than, say, we in the United States think of notaries. So
Yes.
can you talk to me a little bit about, like, what is a notary in Mexico?
Sure. Yeah, and no, so very good question. A notary in Mexico is completely different in terms of their responsibilities versus what we're accustomed to in the States and Canada. In the States, seems like there's a notary next to, every other gas station, right? And, notary in the States, for the most part, they authenticate signatures. Well, in Mexico, it's a lot more serious and a lot more involved than that. So a notary in Mexico has to be at least 35 years of age, has had 3 years of experience working in a notary's office, and when the position comes up to become a notary in a particular city, they have to go through this rigorous studies and examination to pass this exam, and then ultimately the governor of that state appoints that notary, and there are only a set number of notaries, right? It's not like unlimited. You're not going to have 1,000 notaries in Vallarta. So a notary necessarily pretty much has to pass away or retire for that number to become available. So when you
Wow, I
have
did not
something
know that.
notarized, I mean, it's a big deal here in Mexico, and they're the ones again that can transfer title from the seller to the buyer.
So in your experience, I mean, you've been doing this for what, 16 years or something like that. Uh, what
Or
are some
something.
of the ways, something like, what are some of the ways you've seen, a real estate transaction go bust, right? Because of something simple. Like, what are some of the things that people really should keep in mind and make sure that they have, at the closing or whatever it is? Is there certain things that you've seen in your experience of,
Yeah, I mean,
why things go awry?
I mean, anything can happen in I think in any business, and in real estate, it's no exception. I think from the seller side, if the capital gains tax hasn't been figured out beforehand, it can be a problem. Again, for someone who owns a property that's going to sell, that you're going to put on the market, make sure your real estate agent, helps you out and figures out what your tax exposure is going to be. There are ways for a seller to partially exempt or exempt fully, which is around right now $230 $235,000, $240,000 of your gain based on a certain exchange rate. But if you don't have all those ducks lined up, you never did that calculation, and the notary again will provide that capital gains tax calculation, an estimate we can expect to pay at the closing if you sell it at such and such price when all these deductions. And I've seen sometimes sellers, they never got that calculation, so now you're at the closing, and then the notary says, here's your capital gains tax, and they're going to have a heart attack. Like, well, nobody told me this, and they want to back out of the deal. They're not going to go through with it, then it can become a complete mess. I've had, buyers and sellers having remorse. That's why we have the penalty in the purchase sale agreements that people can back out if they wanted to. And sometimes there's a delay in closing for one reason or another. I mean, we went through that whole pandemic, and it was really challenging for those 2 years to try to close on a property for one reason or another, just like in all these other businesses throughout the world. But also, if the seller's trust bank, not all trust banks are equal. Let me just put it to you that way. Some banks are a lot better. They're a lot more responsive. They're better staffed. And they look at all the documentations and respond in a reasonable amount of time. And some banks are a complete nightmare. I mean, I've had closings delayed 9 months to a year or more because the seller's trust bank basically just is it's not a priority for them. So when you're going to put in an offer on a property and the seller is a foreigner, or it might be a Mexican national who happens to have a trust, you want to see which bank is the seller's trust bank, because you may need to kind of take that into consideration for a reasonable closing time. So some of these banks, for the most part, we have like a 60-day closing period from when the offer is accepted until the deed is signed over to the buyer. But with some of these trust banks, you're not going to close in 60 days. You're not going to close in 90 days. You might be safe to put a 180-day close and then have another contingency, another clause in the purchase sale agreement that if it doesn't close within 180 days, you might extend it further. So that's something really important to look at for your buyer's agents to look at when they're preparing the purchase sale agreement to give you the correct time frame when you can anticipate closing with some of these banks.
180 days? That's insane.
Yeah, and really, and there's no real reason why, besides like, the trust division might be such a minuscule portion for that overall income for that bank, and they just don't allocate any manpower to that division. I mean, personally, I would say, why don't you just shut it down then? I mean, you're playing with people's lives. It could be a complete nightmare, and then people, eventually the air is coming out of the bag. The excitement about buying or selling, everyone's just kind of worn out. This is dragging on forever. And they just kind of want to back out, or those thoughts are coming into their mind, So it's really important to look, again, at the seller's trust bank when you're at the offer, so you can decide if you really want to go for this, knowing that it might take some time to close. I had two transactions like that this year. They eventually closed. Again, it's because of the seller's trust bank, but it was pretty painful waiting that long, and it was just taking forever. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Definitely need to set expectations, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
So what if someone's looking to purchase a pre-construction project,
Sure.
right?
Yes.
You have a few of those. How does that work?
Yeah, so the pre-construction contracts are very different from a resale. So for AMPI, for our real estate association, we have this standard purchase sale agreement. It's pretty much like a template for the most part. And some real estate agencies kind of tweak and modify it to fit their needs and put in some extra clauses that correspond to their company, like to put in there, right? But the pre-construction contracts, they're pretty much all different. All the developers, they have their own purchase sale agreements for pre-construction. Their attorneys or legal people have drafted, and they work with their listing agency to fine tune. So you'll see a lot of different clauses. So no two pre-construction contracts might be alike from different developments. And again, you want to make sure you hire a reputable real estate attorney to look at these pre-construction contracts. They're very, very different, right? You're basically buying air until the project is completed. So you want to make sure to look at the penalties, when the delivery is going to be, and some of these projects, the payments, when the payments are going to be due. Some are based on a construction milestone. Some are just based on a certain date on a calendar. It could be quarterly, you're paying something, or monthly. And then you have to pay a balance, let's say at possession. Taking possession of a property and taking title to the property can be two separate dates. Okay, so it's very rare where you take possession and title at the same time, unless you negotiated that in the purchase sale agreement, where you don't want to take possession of the property until the title is signed over to you. Why do I bring this up? Because once a project is completed, there are other steps until title is ready to be transferred from the developer over to the buyer. And that can take a few months, it could take a year or a little bit more. So if you want possession of the property, developer's going to say, usually, a few have can allow you to leave a little bit of money on the side until title's ready. But for the most part, most developers will let you take possession once you pay 100% of the agreed upon purchase price. Some developers might say, okay, you can take possession if you pay us 95, 98% down and the balance when the title is ready. But those are rare occasions, right? Usually, you pay 100% if you're going to take possession. And then that allows you to start using the property. If you're going to rent it, you can start renting it out. And then when the title is ready, then the developer will notify you, and then they start the whole closing process, filling out extra forms, paying the buyer's closing costs to get your title. So, but if you want to wait until title, you don't want to take possession. And again, title can take a few months. It could be a year or so down the road. That's something you're going to have to negotiate before you sign the agreement. So that's in there. But keep in mind, you're not going to be able to use it even though it's ready for occupancy until such time the title is going to be transferred. So that's something you need to discuss with your attorney and to consider how important it is to you to take possession now versus wait until title is ready.
Wow. I just feel like I went to grad school for Mexican real estate. No, but that's so helpful. And I feel like, before people even go and start looking online, right? If you kind of know what to expect, what the timelines could be, that sort of thing, I think that's super helpful. So as we kind of wrap up this discussion, what are some of the key takeaways that you want people to walk away with, right? So if they're really interested in purchasing property in Mexico, what are the key things that they need to remember or keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, just keep an open mind. Well, number one, don't assume that the way real estate is done in another part of the world is the same as where you come from. So be open to learning new processes, new methods, and how things roll, in the real estate market of the city or the country where you're thinking about investing. Connect yourself with a reputable agent. Ask people that have bought there. You can go on social media, and then once you connect with that agent, maybe ask for some references of past clients, and then kind of look them up to see who they are. Nowadays, it's hard for someone to hide. I mean, you could kind of look things up, and you can find their social, like Facebook, or you can find the different accounts, and someone's written a blog about them, or they've written something. There's something about someone or everyone out there, and do your due diligence. That's really the key here, and then. Once you make the selection of the agent, maybe ask him or her, and who are some reputable real estate attorneys in that area, right? And on top of that, maybe ask some of your friends or look on social media to see, if some of these attorneys pop up on different sites as well. So that's really important in terms of doing your due diligence, because this is your money, this is your future. You're making one of the biggest investments of your life, and you want to try your best to cover all ends before you wire $1, 1 peso over to anyone. And then don't freak out when there are terms and conditions in a contract you don't understand, because it is different. There are some things in our purchase sale agreements that it's common sense. You've probably seen it in the States or Canada, but there are some clauses, some documentation that's different. Sometimes people ask, well, why do I have to provide this information? This seems ridiculous. Well, that's just the way it is here. It might be for anti-money laundering laws that are in place, and there's more of that now than when I first started real estate. It's all about anti-money laundering. You want to make sure you're not affiliated with some, cartel, or you're doing anything illegal. All the money's coming from legal sources, and there might not be escrow where you're at. So just kind of take a deep breath, calm down. This is why you want to have the professional, so they can explain everything to you. And you want to have a good attorney on your side, a good agent on your side, and make sure the notary is a good notary. You know, not all notaries are alike. Some notaries have more experience in a particular industry, a particular field versus another. For example, you know, there are a lot of notaries here in Puerto Vallarta, but we only close with a handful of them because a few of the other ones, they haven't done that many real estate transactions, so they're kind of not as experienced as others. So look at, you know, who are the big real estate, the notaries in town that conduct a lot of real estate operations, and that's really important. And you can ask that to your agent and to your attorney as well.
I have to say, I have interviewed, you know, people who have purchased in Mexico and people who have been clients of yours. And I have to reiterate that, you know, finding that key, very reliable real estate agent is going to just be all worth it in the end, because they bring the notary, they recommend attorneys and all this kind of stuff. So, because they're representing you, right? So,
Yes.
and I know that you take your time to talk with your clients and really make sure that they understand the purchase sale agreement, which is really critical for any real estate professional. But yeah, so if you have a really strong team in place, I've heard that it's actually pretty easy, right? It sounds a little complicated when we're talking about it and stuff,
Yes.
but if you have somebody who's going to hold your hand tight, it's the process is pretty smooth.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, you know, and really our fiduciary responsibility, you know, is our client to look out for their best interest. And, you know, a lot of our clients don't know everything that we do, and it's a lot, and we do it behind, you know, it's on the backstage. So on the front stage, we're touring with the client, we're writing the offer, they're signing, we send them some paperwork to sign. Usually there's a lot of paperwork in the beginning of a transaction and some at the end. We go through the quiet spell with the client, but on the back end, we're communicating with escrow agents, other real estate companies, you know, the utility companies, and there's utility transfers. We're filling out all these other forms that you don't see. You know, we've got the notary that we're communicating with. So it's like a spider web of networking and working behind closed doors in a sense to make this process as seamless and as smooth as possible. Otherwise, I mean, if we just kind of sit here and technically talk about every single person that's involved in a real estate transaction, we'll be here for like 6 hours, right? and
Right.
that's
And everybody was sleeping.
yeah, everyone's going to go to sleep. But, you know, I mean, there's a lot that
It's
happens.
something good to listen to before going to bed.
But there's a lot behind that happens that the clients don't see because, you know, that's what we do. That's our job. And then we just kind of try to keep it as simple as possible. But over the years, I mean, there's more and more paperwork, and because of anti-money laundering, and the world has gotten a bit more complicated. But we try to simplify everything, and that's how we have the best people working for us. And we try to network with the best professionals in town to just kind of make everyone's life easy.
That's great. So Daniel, if people want to kind of ask you more questions or find out more about you, where do they go?
Sure. You can always visit my website. It's tanielchemsian.com, or you can email me taniel@tanielchemsian.com.
And if people are really serious about buying real estate in Mexico or moving or retiring to Mexico, we have an amazing program called DreamRetirementInMexico.com, where we kind of do a deep dive into all those things: buying real estate, selling real estate, visas, healthcare, all the things that you need to know to create a smooth move to Mexico. So Daniel, thank you so much for spending time with me. This has been great.
Thanks, Risa. It's always wonderful seeing you.